If you want to go ahead and get your lesson books out, we're on lesson 12 on page 25 in your books. Lesson 12, page 25. As we've been working our way through the narrative of the Old Testament here, we had recently talked about Solomon, and more specifically, the temple. We had seen through 1 Kings how Solomon had gathered together the materials for building the temple, how he had worked on getting the labor together. He built the temple, and then he got the temple approved, and he had this big dedication speech followed with prayer. And then at the very end of all of that, he handed out a blessing to Israel, to the people. And so that's kind of where we left off on question 26. Question 26. So this is in 1 Kings chapter 8, if you need to look it up. But 1 Kings chapter 8, after Solomon finishes his dedication and then his prayer, he does this blessing. And question 26 says, what understanding does Solomon express with regard to the obligation of the people? So that's very wordy, right? But the people have a duty, and Solomon understands something about that. And so what are they going for here? What understanding does Solomon express with regard to that?
If you look at verse 61, you can see, so let your heart be fully devoted to the Lord our God as it is this day, to walk in his statutes and to keep his commandments. And that's very much what God has been telling all of us all along.
Yeah, so this is, he does a really good job of summing up what their purpose is, right? What is the purpose of Israel as being the chosen people? It's to be devoted and obedient to God. But for what reason?
He's the only God.
He's the only God? Okay. That's certainly a good reason. Rick?
Well, I don't remember the exact verse, but in Deuteronomy, God says to do all these things so that things will be good for you, so that things will be well with you and your children.
Right, so it'll be a blessing for the nation of Israel, certainly. So because there's only one God, because God is going to bless them. Let's see, it was verse 61. It's a long chapter. But the part I'm specifically thinking of is up just one verse in verse 60. And it says, so that all the peoples of earth may know that the Lord is God. There is no one else. So building off what you said, building off of what Pat said, yeah, we want to obey God. He's the one true God, but we also want to do this so that the rest of the world understands that concept as well, so that the rest of the world understands that there's only one God, that God is the true God. And as Solomon had previously in his prayer alluded to, he wants for the foreigners to worship God too, right? It's not just the people of Israel. He desires that the world worship God. And so if Israel is showing what a right relationship with God looks like, then more people will want to partake in that. More people will want to do that. And that kind of applies to us today, right? The better that we serve God, the better of a relationship that we have with God, the more we're blessed, right? And the more we're blessed, the more that the rest of the world is curious and wants to know how that they can have that kind of life, right? And so showing what a right relationship with God is, how we're able to handle our problems and deal with our problems in a very different way than the rest of the world, it shows them a path that they might have neglected before, and that encourages them to seek that out. Let's see. So that kind of finishes that little section there on Solomon's address to Israel. But any thoughts on that particular section before we move on to the sacrifices and the feasts? Okay. So now this is still continuing with the same time frame. So after Solomon has addressed the people, now they start sacrificing animals to the Lord. And so question 27 says, what unusual measure was taken due to the abundance of animals sacrificed. And if you look in verse 63, we see just how many animals were sacrificed. It says, "And Solomon offered for the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered to the Lord, 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. And so the king and all the sons of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord." I certainly hope Solomon didn't have to do all that on his own. I'm pretty sure he had help with that. But at Solomon's direction, all these animals were sacrificed. And so that's quite a lot of animals. And so what unusual measure had to be taken due to the sheer abundance?
Well, 65 says that he held a feast.
He held a feast, okay. That's part of it, but there's a piece that comes before that. Pat?
There had to be a place to put them.
There had to be a place to put them? Where? I don't think Solomon built storage lockers and freezers, so what did they do? Matt?
Well, verse 64, in between of what we're looking at so far, I think is where I got my answer. It says he consecrated the middle of the court that was before the house of the Lord, for there he offered the burnt offering, because the bronze altar didn't have enough room. So it sounds like when you look at those diagrams of the temple, out where there's the temple building itself,
right,
and there's the laver, the sea, and the altar, that courtyard all around that he consecrated that. And I don't know if they just burnt stuff on the ground or built more altars or whatever, but that was made holy where they could have more capacity to do those sacrifices.
Yeah. And I'm by no means an expert on the layout of the temple, right? I always have to pull up the diagram so I can see that. But I do know that the further into that complex you get, the more holy everything becomes, right? So outside of that temple space is Israel, unclean, day-to-day life, right? And the further in that you move, the more restricted it gets until you're at the very center, and that's the most holy place, right? That's where God's glory dwells, right? So the bronze altar that Matt talked about is further in, and they had to come a little bit further out because they needed more room because of how many animals. And so moving outward, it's a little bit less holy, so they had to consecrate that place. They had to make it holy for this occasion. And so they had to consecrate that. And yeah, I wish that they had given more details too, because I was curious. Did they have to build more altars? Did they just do it on the ground since all of it was consecrated? I don't know. It didn't give me any more details, at least not that I found. Matt?
And I don't have an answer to that, but I was studying further in the Bible, and I get confused sometimes because you have the tabernacle and the dedication of that,
right,
and then you have Solomon's temple.
Yep.
Then you have Zerubbabel, the second temple.
Right.
And there was some stuff said there. I don't have it pulled up or whatever, but talked about when they dedicated there, they consecrated some of the Levites who weren't priests because there was so much to sacrifice, and so it said that those Levites actually were better at it. They were doing a better job of doing everything right than the priests because it was special.
Right. Yeah, and now I do want to point out that this right here, so this is a deviation from what's normal, right? And we always talk about in the Old Testament, right, God is very particular about the way that things have to be done, right? We talk about Aaron's sons all the time as that example, right? You can't just burn any incense, right? It's got to be the specific incense. And we use that example all the time to say why things have to be done a specific way when God asks for it a specific way, right? Well, God laid out the temple in a very specific way and stated exactly how everything had to function. But this is an unusual case where they did something different. And we don't read about any kind of punishment. In fact, God seems pleased by all of this. So that would lead me to believe that they sought his permission first. Now, I didn't find anything that says that. That's my own personal opinion, is that if there was no punishment coming from this, then clearly they must have had an approval of some kind, whether it was the priest relaying that message or God relaying that message in some other way to Solomon, or Solomon just, seeking the Lord's advice as he normally would. I think that they would have had to go to the Lord and make sure that that was okay first. Because again, you couldn't just do anything any old way that you wanted, even if you thought it was all right. You had to do things by the book, right? Rick?
Yeah, along those lines, I mean, God made allowance for a second Passover if you
Mhm.
missed the correct version
Right.
due to some unforeseen reason, okay?
Yeah.
But he was still particular about how you did it, but he did
Right.
give you a second chance, just like he always
Yeah.
does. But
Yeah. So it's interesting because this is an unusual occurrence because it's a deviation from what they were given to do, but it seems to be an approved deviation is what I'm going for here. Pat?
As we saw in verse 63, how many animals were being sacrificed. They didn't just do it one day. It took 2 weeks to do it.
Yeah, it did take quite a while here to get through. I think it was the feast they said that took this time, which is another thing. I don't think any of these other questions go over that, so we can talk about that here. But because of all these animals that were sacrificed, you would think, okay, after the different parts of the animal are removed and sacrificed, there are parts that are left, right? And that was used for the feast as it's supposed to be. And because of how much was done, this feast that normally takes 1 week ended up taking 2 weeks to happen. So you can kind of compare the time of year that this feast was happening at, and then you can go back to Leviticus, right? Towards the middle of Leviticus, you can find the different feasts, and you can compare which of those feasts happened at what time of year. And this feast is normally a year long or a week long, and it ends up taking 2 weeks just because of the sheer volume of animals that were sacrificed. Pat?
I just happen to think in the New Testament we find that Paul was a tent maker, and he took the animal skins and he prepared them. And so these animal skins, all of these goats and everything, and bulls, they probably had to be cared for too. They didn't just take them and throw them over the fence, so to speak.
Right.
They made them, so some of them still lived in tents.
Yeah,
So they had to use those.
That's possible, yeah. Matt?
Well, and the scriptures would be written on animal skins too. So
Right.
Precious purpose.
Yeah, so it's not like it all went to waste or anything, right? So they consecrated it, then they sacrificed these animals. That goes to God. That's never going to waste. And then, what's not used for God benefits the people. And that kind of leads us into question 28, which says, what caused the people to be joyful and glad of heart as they returned to their homes? If I feasted for 2 weeks, I might be pretty cheerful, right?
Well, they saw all the goodness that God provided for them.
Right. And that's what the Bible specifically calls out as God's goodness, right? They reflected on the blessings and the benefits that they had worshiping God and serving God at this period of time. And this really was a golden time for them. This was a really good time. This was a high point in Israel's history.
And the completion of the temple itself.
Mm-hmm. Matt, did you have your hand up?
Just the same idea. I mean, the fact that the temple, they are privileged to be in the
Yeah.
presence of the Lord in the sense that the
Yeah.
temple's there. That's part of the goodness of the Lord, I think. And then, of course, the feast. All of that together.
Yeah, I mean, it not to downplay it. Certainly, if we were able to be in the presence of the Lord in the same way that they were, imagine you could go back in time and be able to witness one of these things, the cloud leading them at, or the pillar of fire at night, or just any of those times where God made his presence known, or to be close to him in that way. We all seek to be in God's presence today, right? And just to be able to visually see an example of that must have been amazing. So yeah, they were glad because of God's closeness to them at that time, of how good he was to them, and on a maybe more worldly way, all the benefits that they got to partake in during that feast. So
I was just saying too, they didn't have refrigeration back then, so they had to do just so many a day because they would get rank and smelly.
well, I mean, they could cure it and
Jerky.
smoke it. Yeah, lots of jerky for a
A
while.
lot of salt on them to preserve them, and they probably had a lot of doggy bags to take home.
Any other thoughts on the sacrifices? Okay. So now we're moving into 1 Kings chapter 9. 1 Kings chapter 9. And for this question, let's go ahead and read a little bit of text here. 1 Kings chapter 9, and we'll read verses 1 through 9. It says, "Now it came about when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all that Solomon desired to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea which you have offered before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built, by putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there always. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and honesty, acting in accordance with everything I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not be deprived of a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons indeed turn away from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have placed before you, but you go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut Israel off from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have consecrated for my name I will expel from my sight. So Israel will become a saying and objection of derision among all peoples, and this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by it will be appalled and hiss and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this house? And they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and they adopted other gods and worshipped and served them. For that reason, the Lord has brought all this adversity on them. So question 29 says, was God's commitment to put his name there forever, what we read in verse 3, was it conditional or unconditional? And then answer in the light of the whole context. Conditional. I see everybody agreeing. No one disagrees? Okay. So why was it conditional? What were those conditions?
They had to remain faithful and serve him.
They had to remain faithful and serve him, right? It says that, God's going to keep his eyes and his heart on this temple. God's attention is going to be on this temple, right? But he has some qualifiers with these blessings, right? There's a lot of ifs happening here. If you do this, if you do that, then everything will be good, right? They had to keep his commandments, keep his statutes. But if they don't do those things, if they worship other gods, then they'll be cut off, right? So in the future, since we, living now, we have the privilege of knowing how this all plays out, when things roll around and Israel finally does mess up, they go and worship other gods, and God's presence finally leaves this temple that Solomon's built. It actually leaves away from there. They can look back to these writings of Solomon. They can look back to these times, and they can see how God warned them of this. So in no way was this a shock or a surprise. Israel couldn't look back in time and say, why didn't God warn us about this? Or to say, he said he would always be here. Didn't he promise that to David? Didn't he promise that to Solomon? God was very specific with these conditions when he laid it out in front of them, right? So Israel doesn't have an excuse later down the road. They've been warned about these things to come. Any other thoughts on those things? As we get further, we're going to see some interesting stuff as Israel starts to fall away and how God is able to keep all of his promises here. But for now, we jump a little bit forward into chapter 9, and we read about Solomon's relationship with Hiram. Remember Hiram? He was Solomon's king buddy, right? His good friend Hiram supplied him all these goods, all the wood for these building projects. And so it says in question 30, how did Solomon reward or repay Hiram for his services? Was Hiram satisfied with the payment, and how did he feel about that payment? So first of all, let's start. How did Solomon pay Hiram? How did he reward him? He gave him cities, right? But I thought that he paid Hiram earlier, right? Didn't he pay Hiram?
Oh, he paid him in food, right?
He paid him in food, didn't he? Well, so what's he paying Hiram for? I'm making you really dig now.
More services, more timber, maybe, for all the other things he built.
I think that that's exactly what they're going for. When we read about it earlier, the payments were specifically for the temple. Rick?
Yeah, this was probably payment for Solomon's palace or huge house. That was so big.
The earlier payments were specifically for when he was building the temple. But as we know, Solomon had other construction projects, namely his own house, his own palace, right? And he needed wood for that too. And there were several other projects that will be listed out soon. So Solomon is repaying Hiram for some of these services. And so he gives him cities, okay? He gives him cities. Was Hiram satisfied with those cities? Why not? I don't own a city. I think that would be pretty cool, right? Maybe it was just the upkeep. What did he not like about this, Rick?
Well, he said they were good for nothing. Here this says they called them the land of Kabul, which means good for nothing.
Yeah, he called them good for nothing. He's called them Kabul or Kabul. I don't know how to pronounce that, but that's what it means. It means good for nothing. And so apparently Hiram wasn't super pleased, but he takes it in good stride. He accepts them, but he's not well pleased with them. Matt.
So I thought this was a hard question because that word Kabul, I found a different meaning for it. I didn't.
Oh yeah, what'd you find?
I didn't find the worthless meaning. I found the meaning of binding and the meaning of fetters, which both the same idea.
Oh.
You're almost like that maybe. I don't know if the implication was, well, you're giving me these cities in your land, and now our partnership's closer, and you're just kind of enslaving me. I don't know. I was trying to read through the line.
Well, maybe if they were good for nothing, maybe these are, or binding, maybe it's because these were a drain on Hiram's resources. Maybe. It's like if I give you a car, but it needs a new transmission, and it needs tires, and it needs all these mechanical things fixed. Maybe that's the problem.
They give you a horse, and then you have to take care of
all that
stuff.
The gift that keeps on giving, right? So maybe that's what it was going after. It's not really specific in why Hiram wasn't happy with it. We just know that he wasn't pleased by the gift of these cities, which is kind of surprising. I don't know that, at least from what I can see, I don't see how this is a wise move on Solomon's part. I don't know if it was wise because it helped him offload these unproductive cities or something. I mean, it feels like he's kind of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back with Hiram, which I would think wouldn't be great. But maybe this is a way for him to, he's buttered Hiram up enough that he can get rid of these cities to Hiram, and Hiram will, maybe he'll grumble a bit, but he'll be okay. So I don't really know.
I wonder if there's echoes of this in Jesus' time, where can anything good come from Nazareth?
Yeah.
Part of Galilee, like this, whatever this bad reputation is.
Yeah, it doesn't really go into enough detail here for us to really say with any certainty, but yeah, something about this area displeased Hiram. Rick.
And did you see in verse 14, Hiram sent 120 talents of gold? That's like 4 tons of gold.
Yeah.
A lot of gold, and I don't understand what all that was for.
I didn't understand that either.
I didn't know if somebody else had noticed something.
It almost seems like Solomon's giving him a gift, which Hiram doesn't like, and then Hiram is paying for it.
Well, he's also a tribute. He has to pay tribute because he's the lesser king.
Right.
So that may be part of it, but also jumping a little ahead of the business with the ships and the fleet. Hiram's involved in providing support for that, so maybe it's related to the effort with the ships and bringing in gold from were there. And
this is one of those things where I feel like if you were alive at the time, this scripture made a whole lot more sense to you, just because of Jewish custom or the world events that were happening. But, obviously we're given everything we need for salvation. So the rest of the details aren't pertinent for us, but curiosity's sake, this is just one of those things where it'd be really interesting to know more. Okay. Question 31. So now moving into moving towards the ships. We're talking about some of the other building projects that Solomon had going on. So this is continuing down through chapter 9. It starts in verse 15. Question 31. What else did Solomon build besides the temple and the royal palace? So beyond God's house, beyond Solomon's house, what else did he build?
He built storage cities.
Okay.
And things like that to store grain and also places to store his horses.
Okay.
And people, they had to have places for people to build cities for.
Okay. Those are some of the building projects. Pat?
The Wall of Jerusalem.
The Wall of Jerusalem. Yeah. It also says the Wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. So built some other things there. And then there's one other big one that they mentioned.
It says he rebuilt Gezer. I don't know, maybe I'm too far ahead. So.
I had Lower Beth Paran, Bailoff, Tamar, and then the Millo.
The Millo, yeah, that's the one I was thinking.
Whatever else he wanted to build too. Was
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
He even built a fleet of ships.
Right, yeah. He builds ships too. What is the Millo? Does anybody know what that is?
Mine says the landfill.
It says what?
The landfill.
The landfill? Mine said it was a terraced structure.
Well, that's not necessarily incompatible. I think it's a fortification, and so
Okay.
when you build like if you've ever seen the images even today of Masada,
Mhm.
that mountain with the flat top, they build a siege works up against a ramp to get into it. Sometimes they would build those sorts of things as like a defensive, make it a bigger wall. So I think it's the idea that it's a fortified wall structure to keep for defense.
Maybe that's my homework. Maybe I'll see if I can find a picture of what the Millo probably looked like for everyone.
I found it in this dictionary. It said, a mound of rampart built up with the earth and stones. So I guess it was like a fortification.
Yeah. I'll see if I can find a picture for that. Sometimes these things, like the temple, it's so much easier to look at something and figure out what that is. So I'll try and find a representation of that for next week. So for all these building projects, it says, how are workers secured for these above building projects? This kind of echoes back to a previous question that we had on this.
Well, they drafted the people from the land that they were supposed to completely conquer.
Yeah.
And made them slaves.
Yeah. So everybody that was left over, who wasn't an Israelite that they should have driven out, they draft those people, and then those remaining Canaanite peoples become their forced labor, right? And then we know that he still used some Israelites for this, but he put them in charge of these work groups. So they were like the chief officers. They were the bosses that were in charge of these different groups of forced labor. Question 33 says, how did the position of the Israelites differ from the others in the relation to the workforce? And I kind of answered this one for you. They were the officers. I know, I get ahead of myself sometimes, huh? Now, what two problems are mentioned as being solved by Solomon's completed buildings? This one I thought was a little tricky. So.
find an answer in the scriptures, but I thought the idea was having built these fortified cities with a list, that helps provide security for them.
Yeah, I struggled to find what the author was looking for here from the section, from the passage that he referenced. The best that I can come up with is that he's making use of these Canaanite peoples that are still living in the land. So you've got all these people who aren't Israelites just wandering around. So he puts them to good use, right? So maybe that's what he's going for. And then the other one is there's this issue with the Pharaoh's daughter's dowry. I don't know if you guys saw that. Let me pull that up. So the Pharaoh's daughter.
Yeah, that's where.
Yeah, so
Egypt had destroyed that town,
right,
and then he rebuilt it.
Yeah, so it says in verse 16, it says, "For Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and overthrown Gezer and burned it with fire and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city. And he had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife." So this is someone that Solomon's married, is Pharaoh's daughter. And it says, so Solomon rebuilt Gezer, and I'm guessing that if this was kind of owned by his wife and it gets destroyed and he rebuilds it, maybe this is repairing a relationship with a neighboring nation. Although I don't know that that's really fixing a problem, because Israel wasn't really supposed to be buddy-buddy with Egypt. So I don't really know what the author's going for here.
It says in 24 that Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house which Solomon had built for her.
Yeah.
Then he built Milo.
Right.
Yeah.
The Millo, I was looking, the Millo is like some terraced, like y'all were saying,
Yeah.
some terraced
So
land. So it has some connection to building her house and then making that terraced land.
Right. Yeah. What the exact connection is, I can't really say. Let's see. I think we'll pick up with Solomon's fleet of ships next week, because we're kind of running out of time. So we'll answer those last two questions next week, and then we'll dive into lesson 13. And I'll see if I can find an image of whatever the Millo might have looked like, if I can. Like I said, I like to have visual aids when possible. So, all right, thank you. In just a couple moments, we'll turn over and sing the song that Matt selected for us, number 641. But before we do that, if you'd like to get your Bibles out and turn with me over to Romans, we're going to look at chapter 12 and verse 18. Romans chapter 12 and verse 18. Just one verse tonight. In Romans chapter 12, verse 18, it says, "If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all people." There's a lot that's, I feel, is wrapped up in this verse. And so for us to just take a few moments tonight and look at what this is saying to us, one of the first things I think this verse tells us is that there will be times when we don't have peace. Peace isn't a guarantee of a Christian, and Jesus alludes to that so many times. Jesus suffered, and we know that as he suffered, we suffer, and we share in that suffering with him. The world doesn't like Christians, and we will face that time and time again, to varying degrees in different places, but it is something that will happen. We won't have world peace. Right? At least not something that everyone would agree, look at and say, yeah, that's it. That's world peace. We did it. We got it. There are going to be times when we won't have peace. But that doesn't mean that we don't follow after God. We know that God does provide peace to us. We know that he can provide peace in our soul, peace that surpasses understanding. The peace that's being talked about here in Romans is much more of what we think of as peace from an outer standpoint, periods of rest and peace with other men, no times of no conflict. But we also know that the Bible tells us that we have spiritual peace. So even in those times of conflict, we can be at peace. Romans chapter 12, verse 18 also shows us that just because peace may not be attainable at a time, it doesn't justify violence on our end. Because it says, so far as it depends on you. There are going to be people who don't like you, who don't get along with you, who don't want peace with you. And whatever you do, and whatever you say, it might not be enough to get peace with them. Jesus was the Son of God, the living embodiment of the Word made flesh. And Jesus didn't have peace with everyone. If Jesus can't have peace with everyone, I certainly can't have peace with everyone, right? If someone's not going to believe the Son of God, if someone's not going to be at peace with Jesus' words, then nothing will reach them. And we saw that time and time again with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. We saw that happen. And so there are going to be times when you can't achieve peace with your fellow man, and that's not your fault. There are just times when you're in an impasse and you can't reach that peace, but that's not an excuse to just give up. That's not an excuse to say, well, this person's, doing me a wrong turn, so I'm going to do that back to them. It says, so much as it depends on you. Maybe you can only achieve a little peace with them. Well, then you should shoot for that. Maybe you can gain a lot of peace, but maybe it's not quite all the way there. You should still aim for that. Maybe you can't get any peace at all with that person, but at least you can strive to have it in some manner, shape, or form. Try to achieve that. This particular part here reminds me of Abraham and Lot when they couldn't live on the same land together because it was just draining. It was too much. Their herdsmen and everyone were coming in conflict. And so they went their separate ways, not because they didn't care about each other, but because putting a little distance between them was a way to achieve peace. They found a solution in order to do that. Your solutions with people today might be different, but maybe it does include a little bit of distance every now and then, a little bit of time away for tempers to cool or things like that. There are different things that you can do. And so think about the ways that you might be able to achieve peace even with people who don't want peace with you. The last part of this that I want to focus on is where it says who to be at peace with. It says to be at peace with all people. Who falls under all people? Everyone, right? It doesn't say only Republicans, only Democrats, only independents, right? It doesn't say only Americans or only Canadians, right? It says all peoples. It doesn't say all the followers of God and not the sinners, right? It doesn't say be at peace with only God's chosen people, with only those who have been baptized. It says be at peace with all people. We want to be at peace with all people as best as we can, because showing that peace, showing that humble nature, showing that suffering attitude is how Jesus won people over. Jesus didn't come down conquering, although he could have. Jesus came down and through his humble suffering and his example, he won people over. That's how he conquered his enemies, with love, with his love for them. Because Jesus died on the cross for all people. And so in the same manner, we need to strive to follow that example. It's easy for us to be temperamental, right? It's not hard for us to do that. We are a prideful people. We are a short-tempered people. A short drive down the road can get your blood boiling. Turning on the news and watching for 10 minutes can get your blood boiling. It's not hard to become upset with any group of people in the world. It really doesn't take much, but we should really strive not to be that way. We should strive for peace and understanding that sometimes our efforts might not be rewarded, at least here on earth. There will be times when conflict is unavoidable. But we are not held accountable for other people's actions. We're held accountable for our actions. So as much as peace depends on us, let's do that. Let's show peace to everyone. I bring this up because almost everyone here has been baptized. And really what I want here is to invite you to have a peaceful attitude. I want you to challenge yourself to find ways that you can be kind and show love to all peoples whenever possible. But we know that there are things that trip us up, and we're not perfect, and we mess up from time to time. Ecclesiastes says that no one is righteous all the time. And that happens. And that's one of the reasons why we have this time of invitation. It's so that when we mess up, when we make things wrong, we can make them right. So if there's something that you're struggling with that's keeping you from being at peace with all people as much as possible, please come forward, have a seat on the front while we stand and while we sing.